February Free Press Book Club meeting for The Lightning Bottles by Marissa Stapley. I'm going to just do a quick round of introductions. So I'm Erin Lebar. I'm your book club admin, and I'm an audience engagement manager at the Free Press. My colleague from the Free Press, Denise Duguay, is in the host seat tonight. She's a copy editor and writer for the paper. We have Riva Billows joining us from McNally Robinson, and of course our author, Marissa Stapley. Thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Thank
Am I
you so
saying
much.
your name correctly? Is it Stapley?
No, it is Stapley, and
Okay.
everything, including Reese, says Stapley, so I just don't even react anymore. But like secretly give a little like high five to the people who get it right.
Okay,
So
good. I feel honored. Just before we continue tonight, I want to acknowledge that the Free Press and McNally Robinson are both located on Treaty One territory, which is the traditional land of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dene, and Dakota people, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. And Marissa is joining us from Toronto, and I have my notes here because this is not my usual acknowledgement, but just traditional land of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat people. Our meeting tonight will progress as it always does. I'm going to throw to Riva in just a second to do an introduction. Then Marissa will do a short reading, and Denise will then kick off our Q&A. If you do have any additional questions, you can pop them in the live chat box right next to the video, and I will keep an eye on that as we go. And with that, I will throw it over to Riva.
Thanks, Erin. Thanks for having me tonight. And thanks for making time for this, Marissa. We're so happy to have you here. So The Lightning Bottles is a love letter to the 90s and the life-changing music that defined that era. It's written really between two timelines. So in one, we see Elijah and Jane, who's our very fiery protagonists. They form their rock and roll duo, The Lightning Bottles, and they immediately skyrocket to fame. In the other timeline, it's been 5 years since Elijah was declared dead after going missing in Iceland, an event that increased the public hatred of Jane, and there was already so much before. So to cope, Jane moves to Germany, and as fate would have it, her next door neighbor is a 17-year-old Lightning Bottle super fan that's convinced Elijah is not only still alive, but he's also leaving secret messages for Jane. So together, these two timelines, they weave together to tell the story of Elijah and Jane from their very beginning as young, misunderstood outsiders to two famous rock stars who are really coping with and working through two different but very intense substance use disorders. And then, of course, our end, where they're both sober, older, and wiser. And I think really the key to understanding this book comes from the dedication, right? It's Marissa, you wrote it for Courtney Love, for Sinead O'Connor, for Fiona Apple, like just to name a few. So these are women who were very notoriously unloved by the public for their honesty. They didn't smile when they were supposed to smile, and they were like Jane, a total badass. So with that, I will throw it to Marissa.
thank you so much. So I'm reading the moment in the novel when Jane and Elijah are not famous yet. And they go to Central Saloon in Seattle, and Elijah sings the song that will change the trajectory of their lives for the first time. And so it's from Jane's perspective. So we're kind of getting her, we're in her head in this sort of pivotal moment. So they've just has everyone, I don't know. I mean, I don't know if I should assume everyone's read it, but they've just
You can
something.
assume everyone's read it.
Okay, so this is
We don't withhold spoilers here.
okay. So his parents have just died, and it's quite awful. It was a car accident, and his dad was drunk, and this is sort of Elijah's origin. And Jane thought he had this perfect life up until this moment, and was sort of had her own blinders on, and was seeing what she wanted to see. But from the ashes of this difficult moment comes this very pivotal moment for them. She knew how they looked, rain-soaked and bedraggled, like the orphans they now were when they arrived at the Central Saloon. No one paid them much attention, and she could tell Elijah had lost some of his nerve now that they were in the crowded club. But it was too late to turn back when they stepped onto the stage. Dark Shine first, Elijah murmured, and on a borrowed bass guitar, she played the familiar opening of a song she had written and they had practiced together many times. When he sang, his voice was ragged and hoarse, nowhere near as good as she knew it could be. His guitar strumming was hesitant. Most people didn't even look up from their drinks or conversations. Jane wished she hadn't encouraged this. It felt like they were ghosts on the stage, just like his parents. This was just going to make things worse for him. They shouldn't have done this. His parents had just died. What were they even doing here? After Darkshine, there was a smattering of dutiful applause. Someone yelled, "Show us your tits," at Jane, which, by the way, is peak 90s. And she gestured to Elijah that they should go, but he shook his head. "Follow along," he instructed. I'm ready. I have to let this song out, like you said. He began to strum again, a melodic intro that seemed to her to last too long. Something wasn't right about it, but as he kept playing, she found herself gaining an understanding of the music, of what he was trying to do. People in the audience trailed off mid-conversation and watched him. Jane joined in with a simple bass line, and when he opened his mouth, and then he opened his mouth and sang. "You asked if I'd die for you. I didn't know what you meant. But the words were all there for me, from a prophet, heaven sent." With every line, his voice became stronger and more exquisite. I'm not going to sing, but I do know the tune in my head. But you wanted me to sing, and I wanted to play. I took you for granted, had no clue you wouldn't stay. All conversation in the bar had tapered off. Jane thought maybe the crowd was aghast by the raw emotion in his voice. It was too much. She almost stepped forward and told him to stop. He was right to have been afraid to sing a song he had written. It was so honest. She felt panicked as his voice became even more raw. She had to stop him from revealing himself this way. What would he have left for himself? She stepped forward and reached out. And then it came, the moment she'd never forget. Maybe no one there ever would. "Baby, don't cry," he sang, "'cause..." The pause here felt reverent. Everyone held their breath, including Jane. "We're all gonna die." She was sure that somehow everyone in the room knew what Elijah had lost, what they all stood to lose. They were all going to die someday. Everyone they loved was going to die someday, too. It was awful. Then Elijah stopped strumming his guitar and let the moment stretch. He shrugged, flashed a smile at the crowd, and sang the next line. "Might as well just get high." A cheer rose up, but Jane felt shocked. Get high? She struggled to keep playing as she watched this new side of Elijah, the seductive performer, the captivating showman. He had said he was afraid of the honesty of his music, but this wasn't honesty, was it? He had battled getting high tonight and won, but now he was singing about drugs as if they weren't a demon on his shoulder. She pulled her eyes away from him and focused on the faces in the crowd. The audience was clapping along, dancing, bending toward him like they were crops and he was the sun. There was joy in the room, and suddenly Jane couldn't resist it either. Out of the ashes of his pain, Elijah had written a perfect song, one about life and death, about how somehow the shattering truth of existence everyone avoided was okay. She was in awe of him in that moment, just like everyone else in the room. She loved him so much, and she loved his song, too. As she stood behind him, listening to him sing, she knew something for certain. This song was going to change their lives. Nothing was ever going to be the same again. Thank you.
You picked a perfect scene to start with because, well, for me, and I felt so, my heart was in my throat through so much of reading this. I love that era of music, but more than that, it was, I know the fan experience. I'm not a musician, but I know the fan experience of a song that speaks to me and that's so vulnerable. It's overwhelming, whether you're alone or whether you're in the crowd or whether you're seeing someone do it the first time. But this sounds so vividly from the beauty of the creative moment of not, I guess photographers would call it the decisive moment, where you have something to say, but it's saying it. Are you a musician?
No, I wish. When I was writing the book, I went through all my journals and diaries from high school, and I had a band called the Dead Prom Queens. We didn't have any instruments or talent. It was just like this concept. And I had like written liner notes and I had song lyrics. So I think I should be a musician, except I'm pretty sure I have no talent. But I have musicians in my family, and I'm a music enthusiast. And yeah, in my wildest fantasy, I like secretly take singing lessons and then like invite all of my friends and family to karaoke and just like surprise everyone with my incredible voice. But no, but also I wrote all those song lyrics and I used some of the poems that I found in my old journals. And yeah, I got it. People thought they were quite good. So, maybe if the writing thing doesn't work out, I could write song lyrics, no music, just the lyrics. So
Great, that'll be your second act or your third act. So you
yeah.
have that. I think it's in the acknowledgments at the end, you thank a couple of friends, and I don't have their names written down, but a couple of friends for helping you to rediscover your teenage self. And I have all the characters are my favorites, but Hen, the 17-year-old, is she you, or how much of you is in her?
You know, it's really interesting you bring those women up because they're my high school best friends and we don't see each other very often, but they came to town this past weekend. We went to see Dear Rouge at the Opera House and we just had the best time. And yeah, it just, you kind of need people like that in your life sometimes. And they're just so thrilled with all the, the success and things that have been happening. I think there are pieces of me in Hen for sure, in that fandom, that idea that, I mean, I was a very big fan of Sinead O'Connor. I actually went to see her at the grandstand when I was in grade 7. And she felt like such a big part of my life, even though we never met. So that part of teenagehood. But I think with Hen, I had to remember that sort of feeling of almost alienation that you feel as a teenager. And then she was really alienated. So there was quite a few differences. And I think, she's very German, like in the very straightforward way that I don't think I necessarily have. But I do think yeah, like you have to remember how everything just felt so big um, and you could love someone who you never met. And yeah, I really, I felt very affected by Kurt Cobain's death. I was 14. And yeah, so just going back there to those moments, because we had a lot of loss in the 90s of especially in that alternative scene.
Yeah, very big. Everything was super big. And also oh, I just lost my train of thought. One of the questions from our readers, it's a perfect opportunity to talk to one of the questions from our readers that were shared with Erin earlier. You mentioned that she's German, and one of the readers wanted to know what your connection to Germany is.
So it's, I think I wanted it to be Europe because I wanted it to be easy for Jane to move around by train or car and I also just thought it would be more realistic. There is a difference with the way Europeans treat celebrities. Like you can move through Paris and people aren't going to mob you. So I wanted it to be that. And the Berlin Wall coming down just was really caught my imagination and attention. And one of my best friends was her father was German and they went to Berlin and she brought me back a piece of the Berlin Wall and which you weren't really supposed to, but it was so fresh, right? You could just take pieces. And I was looking for a city where Elijah, the street art would be ubiquitous and I wanted it to be a really cool city. So I think that I chose Berlin and therefore Germany. And sometimes there's this magical alchemy in storytelling, like you choose something and then it sort of reveals to you why. And I think it all just worked out so well. I did go to Berlin for a research trip and I was like, yeah, this is it. So but yeah, I think, Berlin's a very cool city and I needed it to be a really cool city. I think it's the coolest, there's something and the dichotomy of the West and the East and sort of, fits into, your public persona and your private persona. And there was just so much that really worked. But I also really wanted Hen to be kind of not just a teenager and sort of therefore difficult for Jane to kind of fully relate to right away, but that matter of factness that I think some Germans do have, where she just kind of would say stuff and Jane wasn't really used to that.
Yeah, and I love the combination. I just remembered my question, so thank you for getting me back there. The matter of factness and the frankness. I love how she takes charge when Jane is very much like no, and she just gets them going. But also, she is still a kid in that way that teenagers are, and she utterly believes that he's still alive and has no. Well, maybe she does, but she is the heart of that belief in forever. And I just thought that was such a great combination of those two those two halves in that character, and it ties everything together.
Naivety that, yeah, you only a teenager would really believe this story. It's almost like she was weaving it herself. Yeah.
Yes, yeah. And then so it was already mentioned that the very strong female personalities that this story is casting light on, and how horribly they're treated. Was that a big part of what motivated this story for you?
Yeah, it really was. I think I I was talking about this. I did a podcast earlier tonight and we were talking about separating art from artists and how like art doesn't always stand up. And the 90s are like there's none of it stands up. And I would show my kids a movie that I liked in the 90s and then think, "Oh my God, like the covert, not just covert, but overt sexism and the misogyny threaded through this." And I just accepted it.
Mm.
And so I always knew, I always, I didn't think Courtney Love got a fair shake. And I was a fan of these, the female fronted bands and the females. And then I started to notice as we began to memorialize the 90s music scene, it was Pearl Jam and Soundgarden and Alice in Chains and all these guy bands who were getting memorialized. And I was there and I know what I was listening to and I wasn't alone and I know what I found the most compelling and it was sure. I mean, I continue to enjoy Pearl Jam, but a lot of those bands weren't really doing anything exciting or different and the women were and they were getting completely marginalized and Courtney Love acted, she has problematic definitely like stuff to reckon with, but also acts like any male rock star and is somehow just very much sidelined and vilified. And Sinead O'Connor was treated so unfairly. It's just shocking. I mean, when her documentary came out and everyone realized what had really happened. So that was definitely a huge part of why I wanted to write this. And it's hard sometimes when you have a message like that. You don't want to suddenly be feeding people like broccoli. You're like, this is good for you to know this. So it was so important to me to also nail a really compelling story where people would get that message, but also maybe kind of stealthily, you'd be kind of going along with the story and realize that, wow, because I really did so much research that it's so accurate. Like and I had Ellen Cross read it twice and there's no mistakes. Like this is what it was like, and this happened.
The underlayer of Jane, and how there's one particular part where she talks about how, no one said that she looked sad. Everyone said that she looked angry. And then there's the reference to, I think she's talking to Petra and saying, Keith Richards did the same thing, and people only talk about the fact that he was having a fling with Margaret Trudeau.
Yeah.
I found it so rich and so not broccoli, although broccoli is fine. And but then there was also, I really liked how, and I only thought of this later as I was coming up with questions, and so it felt very much so natural. But I thought, like, there is that, these women who were pilloried and just like underrated and hated on, but internally, all these women who are so supportive of each other. Petra, there's Alice, there's even the ones that are not like perfect and who don't last the whole novel, that are just so strong with each other. Is that, in your research, was that what you found also, that there was this sisterhood of, that was fortified by this part of music history?
I would say that in the 90s, that wasn't happening as much as it should because women were constantly being pitted against each other. And so they were probably trying to find that community, but it was often, like L7 and Babes in Toyland had a manufactured feud and all of this stuff. And so I think that it's more just now as we're sort of, the scales are falling from our eyes and we're like, holy shit, like this was so wrong and we allowed all of this stuff to just kind of slide, that now this sisterhood, it's more what I experience now in my life and what I'm seeing women embrace so wholeheartedly and realize just how incredible it is to have a strong sisterhood or coven or, anything like that around you, and how women just do come through for each other in such spectacular ways when they're allowed to. So I think, eventually towards the later in the 90s, women started to realize that. And then Lilith Fair happened, which of course was completely like made fun of, and because it made women feel seen, and but I think that moment of, okay, we're doing this and we're together and we're going to lift each other up, and if there's only room for one female headliner, then we'll go do our own thing. That was the beginning of it. So yeah, but I just find in my own life it's just incredible the way I find the women that I need, to be that for me. And, they don't always last for forever, but it's important. So
Yeah, and the calling out of the being pitted against each other is now part of the conversation. It's not, it's still necessary, but it's a
yeah,
sad reality, but it's pretty vigorous reality.
and to just acknowledge it and then interrogate it too. Like now we're starting, because that was kind of the first step, was like, oh, this is happening, and now we're kind of like, but why? And often I find when you interrogate things that don't fully make sense, and then there actually isn't an answer, and that's the good reason to just say, then let's not do that anymore. We don't need that. Like there's no good answer for this. So let's check it.
Okay, another reader question. Someone wanted to talk about your writing process, or get you to talk about your writing process. Blah, blah. And whose story did you write first of the three main stories?
Oh gosh, I mean, there were so many different versions of the lightning bottles. I started it before I started Lucky. I had a lot of interstitial material, journals and diary entries. There was even at one point they had a kid, like, and that to me just became, it was too, what, I couldn't work the timelines out. I was like, this doesn't work. But it was also almost just became too dark. And so I wanted there to be a youthful element, but then it became Hen. It was always really Jane. It was her diary, it was her letters. She was really the one. Her name was Bridget at one point, by the way. So she was first. And then when I realized I needed a way into the story, I created Hen. And I'm telling you, I probably spent as much time on that prologue as I did on like the first half of the novel, because so much needs to happen. And I had started writing chapters in Hen's from Hen's perspective, but there was a few reasons I just couldn't follow through with that. It's Jane's story, like this is Jane's story, so that was important. But also publishing can get a little tricky, where if you have a teenage character, they start to think it's YA and people don't know what to do about that. So I didn't want to fall into that trap. So I knew I had my one shot with Hen, and it all like close, with Hen, and it all had to happen. And I completely understood that some readers would be like, oh, I don't buy this coincidence, even though I find stuff like that happens to me all the time. Like those weird coincidences just do happen. And especially when I'm writing something and I'm really on a roll. But I needed to make that believable, and I needed to just express so much about her. And it took so much. That was the toughest thing I ever wrote.
And Elijah, he just
Elijah, yeah, but he was never the main character. He's not, like I knew, so I never tried to, I considered writing some chapters from his perspective as I was trying to in the third act, and then I never did. I had a moment of really understanding him when Florence and the Machine came out with her most recent album, and there's a song called Morning Elvis. You listen to it, and I remember just standing in my kitchen, and I had a couple glasses of wine with my husband, and I was getting something that came on, and I was like, okay, I get you. Like he felt like he was there, and I was like, that is, that I guess I got my wish, anything but this. Like it's so him. And so I really felt I understood him. And there's a lot of Jeff Buckley in him, and not a ton of, I did a lot of research on Kurt Cobain, and I think Kurt was so tortured. He was just so tortured. It was just, it's almost, you can't dive into that. Like, and there was so much addiction and it's complex, but some of Kurt in there, but more Jeff Buckley. So, but yeah, he was always kind of there. I always knew he wasn't he wasn't the main character, as men
As
always are. So he wanted to talk, and I was like, no, it's okay. We'll we'll get to you.
I found this balance very satisfying.
Yeah.
I had a process question, or a kind of framing question, I guess. Like right from the prologue in the first couple of chapters, I usually have to not drug myself. I usually have to really force myself to get through the first 75 pages of novels, just because I don't know if it's a COVID thing. A lot of people have a hard time settling down to read. But I was like in right from the beginning. So I totally, I hear you about that prologue taking so long to write, because it just was beautiful. It was perfect. But it made me feel so, it was such a comfortable place, and you had such a sense of authority about the story that you were telling, that I was certain of how it was going to end. And that's not the way it ended. I expected that they would get to the end and it would be like, oh, he's alive in my heart forever.
Yeah.
And he's really is alive. And as soon as I like had to put the book down and just like have a good cry, because I was so happy that this, hen's dream and everybody's, that Jane was wrong. He really was alive. Was that kind of, was I the only person that felt tricked, or did you want me to feel tricked, or to set up an expectation that you
yeah, I love that. I just, he was never dead. And I knew he was never dead, but I definitely needed to hide the ball on that one to keep people going. I think that's sort of the trick of the storyteller too, right? To keep the secret. So I wanted people to think he was really dead to move the narrative along. But I wanted there to be that hope. And there were some readers who were like, no, they knew all along. But the reason that I wanted him to be alive is because when I was doing my research and when I was looking at, someone like Kurt Cobain or anyone who was addicted to drugs in that era, so few people did survive. And every time I would read a memoir, that person would no longer be alive. I also read Matthew Perry's memoir, and you don't make it out of addiction. It can be so, you don't, right? And it's so bleak, and it's such a horrible disease. And I kept thinking, if like escape feels like the only option, like getting out and just escaping, just in that, that's why people go to rehab, but also like for fame and addiction that's tied to fame, you have to just get out. And I thought to myself one day, like Kurt Cobain could never have survived unless he just like took off and was living in Alaska, like in a fishing hut somewhere. And kind of became a little fascinated by that. And that's like going way back to when I started thinking about this book. So I guess as much as I say, Elijah was never the main character, I think the impetus of the story was kind of like, but what if somebody actually made it out by just disappearing, and also really growing up, right? Because he needed to grow up. So I always knew he was alive, but I really didn't want everyone to know that. So I'm glad I tricked you, and I'm sorry you cried, but that's just beautiful to me. I love that you were so happy that, yeah, that's nice.
I was so excited. And I will say that my strongest theory was that Maxime was orchestrating the whole thing.
Oh.
And that Maxime was her true love.
Yeah, that's an interesting moment in the book that I really like, and I wanted that for her because Jane never got to be with anybody else. So that kiss was really important in the way that he wanted her and made her feel seen in a different way, and she could have had a different path, yeah, I like that. I see like in a future, like if there's ever it's been optioned for TV, that like Maxime, they're not done,
Mhm. Can I hop in and ask a quick question?
Yeah.
I had chills. Oh, the woman on the boardwalk when I was reading that, when she first appears. So right, I think they had some good news. Elijah and Jane are walking on the boardwalk. They're having their champagne. They're having a great time. And you mentioned this woman who smells like urine. She walks by them and she's muttering something about an audition. And then, of course, at the very end of the novel, Jane becomes that woman. And I had goosebumps. I was like, oh my gosh, that's obviously why she wrote that at the very beginning, cyclical moment. And I guess that is my question for you is does Hen break the cycle? Because that's where I'm left at as a reader, knowing that the end is in the beginning. It starts in this chat room, it ends in this chat room. And, you know, of course, Hen is saying, like, oh, I'm taking it easy. I was just drinking that one time and it's never going to happen again. But then I think about Jane and how she became the woman that she saw on the boardwalk. And, you know, I guess my question to you did that cycle get broken? Did it get left in the 90s now that we're in the year 2000? What do you think?
I love that question. I actually, if you've been to LA, just want to say about that woman, like, you know, LA is so, it's La La Land. It's like there's just all this beauty and wonder, and then there's this dark side, which we have seen, you know, with the fires and everything too. But I remember the first time I went to LA with stars in my eyes, and that woman, I swear, like, that woman walked by me and I was like, oh God, like, this is a place of broken dreams. Like, this is just awful. And so that just stuck with me. So I wanted to put her in, but it's funny because I put her in and then I never, up until I was writing and even editing, realized that, okay, this is going to become Jane. Like, that's not even why I put her there. She just was there to sort of represent the dangers, kind of lurking for Jane. So I just love that you noticed her, and yes, and then it became important to me that this that yeah, Jane became her, then had to come back out of it. But no, I feel that Hen definitely breaks the cycle. Like, she's so tough, right? And she's been through so much, and she's very, you know, I don't see her ending up in the same situations they did. I think there'll be other issues for her, and fame, of course, will have its way with her as it has its way with everyone. But you look at, you know, some people are just seem really well able to handle it. And you could look at someone like Taylor Swift and you're like, how in the world do you do that? Of course, because she's a woman, she has to do it a million times better than anyone else and still get, you know, booed at a football game, but that's a story for another day. So I do see her having that same sort of tenacity, and you know, but maybe someone in her band just kind of goes off the rails, or maybe it's heartache that gets her, because there is definitely, you know, more to her story, but she's not going to be a rock and roll cliche.
Yeah. Now, I think that speaks to also just the tragedy of the 90s, and that as we enter the 2000, it probably did put a cap on that
Yeah.
in some way.
Yeah, everyone was like, oh my God, like that was such a bad look for so many people. And we just, you know, so yeah, and things started to change in the 2000s. And I think now, you know, there's just so much more. And I notice with my kids, we have so much more language and ways of talking about these things and dealing with our emotions and getting help when we need it, that we just did not have. We were just kind of on the edge of it in the 90s.
The mom, Janet's mom, she doesn't come back.
Yeah.
There's no happy ending for her. And I found it's not, I can't say it's my favorite part of the book, but I found it very satisfying that painful thread is not woven into the story. Like, there's no happy ending there, because that's so brutally, that happens. How did you deal with that when you were figuring out what to do with that character?
I was kind of thinking about Courtney Love's mom and how she wrote a book about her, and how I don't think they've ever really had a record. I don't know, but it does happen, right? And that these people who are so creative and these larger than life personas often come from a place of great pain. And I don't understand that type of behavior, but because I had a great mom, and I like to, I think I'm a good mom, and you know, I see family as very important, but yeah, I think that was where Jane was coming from, and she needed to come from a place where there was such coldness, and I didn't see things ever reconciling with her mom, unfortunately for her. And that's partly why the Elijah piece is so important for Jane. Like, he is her family. He's really all she has, right? And that.
Yeah, I wanted to ask another question. So, of course, throughout the book, like it's very fun because you will sprinkle in, of course, some tons of references to bands that actually existed. And I was only alive in the 90s for just 3 years, so I did have to Google some of them. But I did know quite a few, I will say.
Yeah.
But then, of course, there's some like Sinead O'Connor. There's huge, obviously, you took huge inspiration for. There's an Irish singer in your book, and I was just wondering, how did you decide who to take real life inspiration from versus who to actually put in? There's like a fun Bono moment at the Grammys where he's congratulating Jane, which I'm like, that just must feel great for Bono to congratulate you. And that has that impact because, of course, most people know who he is. And so there's that extra emphasis on that moment. But how do you decide, like, who do you take inspiration from versus who do you actually just have a cute, like, wink or nod to?
Yeah, you know, it was so it was kind of interesting because there were points where I would have the real bands and then I would change it. So that scene with Fia Connolly, that I had it written as Sinead O'Connor. And then I thought, oh, the Sinead was still alive when I was writing, excuse me, the book. And I had it in my head. Maybe I'm more hen than I realized that she was going to read the lightning bottles and she was going to feel better about everything, which is not what happened. But it's so it just is so funny that you can think that this is fandom, right? We have these fantasies. And I thought maybe it would feel weird to her to see herself in the book. So that is why I changed it. But I also changed it because Jane was there and it felt also strange to insert someone into a scene that was real. But it just, and with like I didn't have a Kurt Cobain, because I just, I felt like I wanted to be really careful what I said about him, but I had, the Zach character who's very similar. And then yeah, I think I did what felt right, and it changed sometimes from draft to draft. And sometimes I would change, like the Contagion is really the Cure, but I wanted to use some of their lyrics, and I couldn't get the rights to any Cure songs, so I had to just change it to the Contagion, and so that, yeah, it kind of that was sometimes it was utility and necessity, but it was just really what felt right. And I was creating my own world, and it was really an interesting feeling to sometimes be populating it with real people. And I think that that moment of Bono congratulating her, like especially in the 90s, that there was no one, and Michael Stipe sitting on the other side of her. Yeah, I needed to have that be real. There could be no question about who it was.
Who did you have in mind for Helen Sear, the
Yeah.
folk singer?
This she's sort of based on Joni Mitchell, but Helen Sear is a cameo from my debut novel. So
Oh,
Mating for Life, I know. It's so I'm like Taylor Swift with the Easter eggs now. Helen Sear is the matriarch of the sisters in Mating for Life. And so she's essentially a made-up folk singer from my debut novel who did lose someone. And so yeah, I realized I needed her to have a pivotal conversation. And I always thought, well, if this is a music book, I want to put Helen in it because I just think that would be really fun. So, but yeah, she sort of is a bit based on Joni Mitchell, if Joni Mitchell had had 3 daughters. Um, so yeah. But yeah, she's from Mating for Life. So good reason to go back and read my debut.
Speaking of, so yeah, leaving on the fact that Jane and her mom never reconcile, of course, is so realistic because how can you come back from a lot of what's happened between the two of them? And then I also wonder too about the decision to never for oh my gosh, Kim and Jane, and that feud is so intense throughout the entire book. And of course, the napkin plot twist, which I did not see coming. And I actually I'm gonna segue too and ask like was there like I had no idea, were there little Easter eggs for the napkin coming back and it actually being Kim before it's revealed? Because I didn't pick up on anything. I was totally not expecting that.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I believe that when they're going to the Central Saloon, he has like she sees him put a napkin in his pocket, or like
Oh,
there was, yeah, because I kind of planned because I think it was, yeah. And so, but yes, it was always very early days where I realized because I needed to make Elijah very imperfect, and he had to have his journey to finally be worthy of Jane and grow up and all of this stuff. And I realized, he really did steal that lyric. But also it's like an interesting question of like, but also, the flute sequence in Stairway to Heaven, they stole that and made this whole thing with it that, probably he wouldn't have made. Like, that's the interesting thing about art and music. Who is the real artist? So I was just kind of playing with that.
Yeah, and the fact that Jane sticks to kind of her guns and never gives in, right? And that's like the
Yeah.
first scene when she's in the house and Petra's like, he's trying to sue you again. She's like, yeah, I'm never going to let this go.
Right.
Like, why do you think the fact that Jane just keeps, and he even says, Elijah says, right, he's like, I thought that you would maybe at a certain point just let him take the case, and she never does. Why did you make that decision for her character to like never have that breaking point?
Yeah, because I mean, she is so tough, right? And you look at what happened with her mom and her mom, they never reconciled. So I think with Jane, as far as she was concerned, it didn't matter if it was his line. Like, he did so much other stuff to them and he undermined them, and she was just never going to forgive him. And as far as she was concerned, he didn't deserve it. Like, that was just one stupid line while he was high, and Elijah turned it into something amazing. And so, right or wrong, she was like, I will never, ever let you have this. And that just goes to show you, like, Jane is tough, right? She just, yeah, she's a badass. So there was just no, yeah, I know Elijah's like, I really like, and it's funny because it just shows that, he did have some sort of growing and growing up to do, because he even in a way didn't fully know her if he thought that she was ever just going to hand that over to him.
But that he knew Kim so well. He played him so well, knowing that Kim would always want to have the stage to himself.
Yeah.
I thought that was brilliant. That was very satisfying.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. No, I had fun with that for sure.
We probably have time for just one or maybe two more questions. I'm not sure if there's any reader questions left that we haven't gotten to yet.
I'll hog it for the one last question and say I met my husband in the mid '90s. This music was the music of our courtship, and we hung on to it. And I still have all of the mixtapes that he made, and it was so beautiful and emotional, and their romance was so great. Even though you could see all the pennies dropping, and that things were going to be difficult. Is it hard to write romance?
Well, do you know I write romance under a pseudonym? Like,
I did not know that.
no, yes, I do. And I love it. It really gives me a lot of joy. I started doing that just before, sort of around the time I wrote Lucky, and I was sort of having a backup plan, and also just thought, you know what, I love this. So, and I think it gives me so much. I love writing people falling in love. I loved those scenes in particular. It kind of reminded me a little of the Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow too, there when they were writing to each other. And there's something about letters and, the nostalgia that I feel for the 90s when I think about my husband and I, it wasn't in the 90s, but we were, emailing each other in the early 2000s. And the idea of certainly the relationships I had in the 90s where you left your house and when you came back, like the guy that I was waiting for to call had called, like there's just nothing that can compare to that. And it's so hard to explain to my kids. And I'm sure there are things that they're experiencing that don't understand too. But I found I was so easily able to get caught up in the nostalgia of that. And those scenes were my favorite to write. And also my favorite to reread, the like however many times I had to reread it with the edits. I would always think, oh, I feel this. I'm falling with them. And that was important too, because you had to, even though, as you said, the pennies were dropping and you knew what you knew or knew what you thought you knew, I really needed the initial days to feel the reader to feel that ache and longing and fall in love at the same time in order to follow them on this journey. But that's so, yeah, the BBS, like that was just so, like I remember chatting with a guy there, and it was like this so different than what we experience now. I don't even do, like, it's like a black screen with typing on it, right? That was it. It was messaging. And if you were really lucky, somebody could use the dashes and the dots to make a picture. It's
I
just
grew up in MSN Messenger days, so that really hit me in my heart.
yeah. Yeah, it's I sort of started the book thinking, oh, the 90s sort of wasn't really that pivotal. And when I started doing my research more into the era, I was like, oh my God, this was pre-internet. We didn't know what we were walking into. And it was actually so innocent and falling in love was different by letters. So yeah, so I'm so and I think that's so cool about you and your husband. I love that.
Oh, I just loved it. Thank you so much. Very lovely book.
Well, thank you for this whole discussion, ladies. This was wonderful. And Riva, thank you for your very insightful questions. And Denise, of course, for leading the discussion. Marissa, for your time and for your writing. Obviously, we all really enjoyed this book. I just want to mention quickly that our next book is Prairie Edge by Connor Kerr. This is a Giller Prize finalist. We're really excited to have Connor next month. And it's, as I mentioned, to all these lovely folks before the call started, it's our 50th book, 50, our 50th book, 50th meeting. So for those of you who have been with us since the start, very much appreciate your continued participation. Thank you all again for watching. Thanks to everyone, to Marissa and Riva and Denise for their time and their thoughtful discussion tonight. And we will see you all again next month. Good night.